So many of you here are colleagues and friends, and I would like to speak to you in that temperament as colleagues and friends. You heard from our earlier panel, Judge Foutet, Orest, and Nadia, of the reality of the situation in Ukraine. It's not a pretty picture. There are many obvious problems, and for many of us there are great disappointments at what might have been, and the reality doesn't look very good. The strategic relationship, we're talking about a strategic partnership. I take these words very seriously because, as some of you know, I had to deal with the magic, perceived magic of those words in the earliest days of Ukraine's history. We didn't want to accord the idea of a strategic partnership to Ukraine because we weren't sure what Ukraine would become. There was deep skepticism about the future of Ukraine. Would it survive? Would it be reabsorbed into Russia? Would it become the basis of a new Soviet Union? What about the nuclear weapons? What about the stability of the state that was posited? Was it a fiction, or did it have any shred of reality in it? And I can tell you quite frankly that there was great debate within our government about that future. And it turned, in a symbolic way perhaps, on the term strategic partnership. And I speak to this issue because I was part of the wrestling match. Strategic partnership had to do with the history of the time. Great Britain is a strategic partner. It has a special relationship. Those terms you're all familiar with. Strategic partnership meant, in NATO terms, the possible use of nuclear weapons to defend the territory of a partner. These were all notions that were taken very seriously, and of course these notions thankfully have passed into history. We have many strategic partners now, but strategy has changed just as the world has changed. The end of the Soviet Union was a change of the world. Perhaps it was the end of the colonial era in Europe. Perhaps not. But there have been many changes since in which the world has changed. 9/11. Our country changed profoundly internally, as we know. We now have to take off our shoes, our belts, and submit to all sorts of X-ray experiments in order to prove our integrity. We are deeply suspicious about terrorist movements, real or imagined. We have the danger of profiling. We look at the world very differently than we did in the confident days after the fall of the Berlin Wall. And we look at our friends differently, of necessity, as the issues that compel us have changed. Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons, its entire arsenal, the third largest arsenal in the world, aimed at the United States, in a great and noble act of policy. Ukraine decided to be a non-nuclear weapons state, and there was resistance within Ukraine, as you all know, about the wisdom of giving up the nuclear arsenal because of the bargaining chip value of those weapons, even if they no longer had destructive value. This was a great act, an inspiring act of profound importance by the Ukrainian government and people. We all lived through that, and we understood the significance of that profoundly important action. In 1996, Judge Foutet, perhaps more than anyone else, understands the significance of that, the framing of national values, the values of the new nation, a categorization of what should be done by the new state, and also what should not be done by the new state. It was a compilation of all of the horrors of the past to be avoided, and the aspirations of the future to be obtained by consistent and dedicated work to the idea of a new, democratic, independent, sovereign nation. Those were the principles. But as you all know, the first governments of Ukraine were under the form of the party of power. Whichever power there was, that was the party. It was a unitary party state, even though there were the beginnings of fractions, what we would call fractions, and proto-parties. There was certainly the basis provided by Ruch, but everyone was for sovereignty and independence, and the transformation of Ruch into a real opposition party, as we all know, never took place. So Ukraine is still in the combat, the domestic combat of forming a political system of parties which are viable.